Continuing with climate adaptation, we know that we have been looking at the general principles from the World Bank book that we used in the first set of podcasts to define the principles for adaptation. Then we used some IMF staff notes to look at economic principles, fiscal policies, and integrating them into the budget process for adaptation. We looked very briefly at health and food security. Now this is a nice report from IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency for under the UN. And this is a report from 2021 titled Bracing for Climate Impact Renewables as a Climate Change Adaptation Strategy. It has some good points, so I'm just going to go through them again very briefly. The report itself is not much longer than what I'm presenting, but I'm still brief, so you must definitely go back to the report and read it if you are interested more, knowing more about this. Okay. Executive summary, let's go through that just to orient ourselves so that if you want to skip the other details, you can. The impacts of climate change are being seen with increasing frequency and intensity around the world. We've discussed this in various ways, especially the IPCC AR6 summary and the climate science, climate change course. Climate change mitigation actions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions remains vital, but is just one of the two main pillars of climate change response. So adaptation and mitigation are the two pillars. Mitigation is easier. You are tackling greenhouse gases, you are dealing with reducing emissions with renewables, electric vehicles, electrification, various in reducing emissions from agriculture and so on and so forth. Adaptation, as I've said already repeatedly, is a very local thing. It doesn't have a blueprint that can easily be applied everywhere else. And some scientists argue that IPCC hasn't been very as detailed in discussing adaptation as mitigation because it's not so easy to develop world level scenarios for this. You have to go down to regional scales. Nonetheless, the critical importance of the second pillar, adaptation, action to just adjust and protect against the impacts of climate change, what we would call manage the unavoidable, has gained significant recognition in recent years, and an increasing flow of finance to adaptation activities is being seen at the international and national levels. Many climate adaptation strategies require considerable energy use, yet the role of reliable, affordable, and modern renewable energy services in climate adaptation is not widely acknowledged in policy making or practice. So you are thinking always about replacing fossil fuels with renewables for mitigation, for reducing emissions, carbon intensity of the energy production, and so on. And yet you need a lot of energy for adaptation as well. This report discusses the benefits of renewables-based adaptation and illustrates the importance of renewable energy with an integrated mitigation adaptation approach to climate action. So mitigation and adaptation are not obviously always independent. There are many schematics given where there is a Venn diagram. You have two circles, adaptation and mitigation, and they overlap, and in that overlap you have many ideas, actions, strategies, policies that serve both mitigation and adaptation. Okay, the report explores three main areas: strategic role for renewable energy in climate change adaptation and in mitigation adaptation synergies. Renewable energy can significantly contribute to climate change adaptation and create opportunities for innovative practices to address climate change. Each of these bullets has some more text which I won't necessarily read except when I subjectively decide that I need to read them. Renewables allow implementation of energy-intensive adaptation solutions such as air conditioning, desalination, and irrigation with net zero emissions. What do we mean? Warming is happening everywhere, especially global south. For a country like India, where heat waves means air conditioning, which is a easy adaptation step, and with the growing incomes, middle class families can begin to consider air conditioning as a necessity rather than a luxury as it used to be or is when you have low incomes. But air conditioning has a strong feedback to global warming. But if you rely on renewables to run your air conditioning, and also works for water supply with desalination and of course irrigation for food production, then you can presumably design renewables to serve the net zero emission goals of all these adaptation solutions. Okay, so these are sustainable win-win solutions. Of course, we haven't done it at scale, so it's always tricky when you actually have to do implementations of these so-called sustainable win-win solutions. Distributed renewable energy solutions, technologies that provide power outside a central grid, can create a resilient energy system and therefore support vital adaptation measures for the most vulnerable communities. This is playing out in many places now. In US, for example, almost the entire country is baking under the heat wave, and demand for electricity energy goes up during a heat wave, and this causes, there's a strong breeze here. I live without an AC, adaptation, but or mitigation, and I leave the window open, so there's a cross breeze. Even though it's a monsoon, it's a break period. Strong winds kick in when that happens here in Mumbai, which is nice, but can spoil the recording. So energy demand goes up during heat waves, which begins to strain the grid system, energy supplies, and so on. But if you have wind and solar, which are very amenable to having local supply, you can have windmill in your backyard, solar on your rooftop, and so on, then they can be off the grid and reduce the stress on the grid during peak demands that are coming during a heat wave or other winter storms for heating and so on and so forth. Okay, so distributed renewable energy solutions are important. Renewables can also deliver non-energy services that contribute to climate adaptation. This multifunctionality enables renewable energy technologies to provide additional forms of resilience to climate change. What do we mean? Here we'll read a bit of the text. For instance, the multipurpose nature of hydropower and bioenergy technologies is well recognized, and their non-energy services have been used in real adaptation projects, such as solar shading, for example, honey production under solar panels to improve food security. So it's a co-benefit or a non-energy service in this terminology. To reduce evaporation on agricultural land, use of byproducts from biogas facilities to make organic fertilizer, and water harvesting from hydropower dams. Well-designed and integrated climate adaptation policies should take advantage of the energy and non-energy services that renewable energy technologies provide. So the co-benefits can be very important. Of course, renewables can also reduce pollution from fossil fuel power plants and have benefits to health, etc. as well. Okay. Second pillar here, planning and financing for renewables-based adaptation. Many countries recognize renewable energy as a synergistic mitigation adaptation measure and incorporate it into their nationally determined contributions, NDCs, that everybody signed on to under Paris Agreement, a more democratic bottom-up proposal to manage climate mitigation and adaptation. Also, long-term development strategies under Paris Agreement has been adopted by many countries under renewable energy as a synergistic mitigation adaptation measure. Okay. Climate finance provided and mobilized for adaptation activities has significantly increased, rising to US $16.8 billion in 2018 and accounting for 21% of total climate finance, up from 17% in 2016. So that's a 4% jump in 2 years, which is a good thing. However, a considerable amount of adaptation finance remains untapped, and renewables-based adaptation could be a prime candidate for these funding opportunities. We have looked at some of these ideas under IMF as well, IMF Staff Report podcast as well. Projects involving renewable energy for adaptation are gaining ground. On the other hand, they already compose around 42% and 60% of projects for adaptation in the financial aid of the Adaptation Fund and the Green Climate Fund, respectively. There are lots of details there about how these are set up, whether they are really reaching the people who need them, or whether they are just being used by people. Some countries put in the money into Green Climate Fund as agreed upon under Paris Agreement, and then just take it back instead of letting it flow to the developing world, the global south, and so on and so forth. Okay. With rising interest in corporate environmental, social, and governance practices, the emissions mitigation provided by renewable energy technologies can help leverage private investors and propel the flow of private finance into climate adaptation projects. Very good point. Thirdly, the way forward for renewables-based climate adaptation solution. This is something we will discuss in details. This is just the executive summary, so let's just run through this in case you want to skip the details. A holistic approach needs to be taken to integrate renewable energy into the climate change adaptation process at all levels of upstream and downstream decision making. This integrated and holistic approach would help identify the contribution of renewable energy to adaptation, promote synergies with mitigation and sustainable development, so SDGs, and maximize the overall benefits of renewable energy while minimizing the trade-offs. A clear framework provides a strong basis for climate adaptation. It is therefore critical that countries establish a clear climate rationale based on the best available science and through which renewable energy technologies can be embedded in adaptation policies, programs, and projects. Okay, renewables may contribute more than one adaptation, mitigation, or sustainable development objective, while producing greater impact with fewer resources. Renewables are not necessarily without demand for resources, right? Land use, land demand, especially for bioenergy, water demand, competition with food security, even solar and wind require land, right? Many times clearing out other uses like maybe forests and so on. Renewable energy options must be integrated into short and mid to long-term decision-making and planning processes to mainstream, structure, and scale up renewable energy adaptation projects. This integration can be best realized by creating an enabling environment for private investors to catalyze private financing and supplement public spending, ensuring the engagement of finance ministries in adaptation planning, and engaging international climate finance. Under fiscal policies, we talked about reducing barriers to engaging international climate finance and so on as well. As climate risks keep changing with time and multiple sectors interact with one another, projects should include continually evolving processes for monitoring, learning, and managing changes. So you have risks for the future for which you are adapting to. They come with their own uncertainties, and they are not fixed in time. You may invest a lot of money in offshore wind farms, and the winds may begin to weaken. So can you design a wind farm as floating so that you can move it when the winds change, and so on? Okay. Thirdly, okay, I don't know why I reintroduced this here. Okay, so we'll come back and look at examples of energy services for adaptation benefits and further details. I don't think I'm done with the executive summary yet, but I will continue with the table in the next podcast. Okay, see you in the next podcast. I'll see why I put these slides twice. It happens sometimes I'm preparing and I forgot that I already included it, but nonetheless, no harm done so far.